This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. We are in another COVID-19 episode of remotely socially distancing while we podcast. And today I'm talking with co-founder of Superstition Meadery in Prescott, Arizona, Jeff Herbert. Welcome to the podcast, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me.
If you are a subscriber to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine and got a recent June-July lager issue, you will see a little secondary feature package that we did on mead making and a breakout brewer story on Jeff Herbert and Superstition Meadery. So we thought, since we've done the coverage there, we might poke around the corners and also talk a little bit here on the podcast about process, about vision, about inspiration, about recipe, about ingredients and all of those other things that go into mead making, which is a little bit of a stretch for us here. Obviously, our podcast is primarily, or magazine is primarily focused around beer brewing, but in an interesting way, it seems like the beer audience and the homebrewers have particularly found mead attractive. And so we've kind of adopted, or mead and beer have kind of become partners here in this kind of communal cultural sense. Before we start the conversation, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and more. Trust G&D to chill the beer you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, Old Orchard invites you to step up your fruit game with their premium craft juice blends. Whether you're planning a passion fruit Kolsch, Concord Sour, mango lager, or other fruity brew, Old Orchard can supply you with consistent product at affordable prices. Their blends are packed with real fruit and natural flavors with no added sugar or other weird fillers you'd find in knockoff brands. With the rising demand for fruity seltzers and brews, the time is ripe to grow your relationship with the right juice supplier. Get your Old Orchard sample kit today with free 6-pack cooler at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Jeff, we normally start the podcast off with a bit of kind of historical background. It's always interesting to see how people got to where they are, what those moments were that that kind of pushed them in this direction of making craft beverages. What was it for you, and where did it start? And walk me through some of the progress of how you got into making mead and then decided to start a business around it.
Well, that's a great question, and it's kind of a cool story, and totally connects with homebrewing. So I think, like almost everyone I've met in the industry, with few exceptions, and the industry being craft beverages at large, right? So it's craft beer, but also I would put mead and cider into that. Everyone that I know that's a brewer or an owner or both started out homebrewing. And I think the dream of every homebrewer is to one day, be able to see their ideas get to a commercial level. And there's so many different ways that can happen. So for me, it all started in a very interesting way. I was in Borneo, and my undergraduate degree was in anthropology from ASU. And I've always had this interest in culture, history, religion, mythology, and it turns out that mead's totally intertwined with all those interests, which is cool. So anyways, I was in Borneo on this solo trip for a few weeks, and I wanted to go. One of my goals as like an anthropology major was to meet like a traditional hunter-gatherer tribe, because I think we're the last generation on Earth that will ever have that opportunity, right? I mean, there's still about 100 uncontacted tribes out there. So there's this, it's just this awesome call to adventure. It's a representation of the last frontier of something that, is out there that's untouched. And so in Borneo, there's a group of people called the Penan that there's only a couple hundred of them that still live in a traditional way. And I wound up spending a week with with a Penang guide in a village, and we wound up finding this semi-nomadic family, the last group that lived in this part of Borneo. And so it was just kind of this like weird bucket list goal for me that kind of came true. And in that process of visiting Borneo, there was this like a hostel for backpackers on the coast in this town called Miri. And all these different kinds of people would come through there. And one day I was at the bar down below, and like the best beer they had was Guinness. So I was sitting there having a Guinness, and there's some other travelers there that were staying in this hostel. And one of the guys turned out was a biologist that was doing research there. And it turned out he grew up 10 minutes from where I lived in Arizona. And, we just kind of stayed in touch. And he would come home to see his parents from like his travels and different jobs he had from time to time. And one time at Christmas, he said, "Hey, I'm going to visit my folks. Do you want to hang out?" And I said, "Yeah, come on by. We'll have dinner." Well, he brought 3 homebrew beers with him, and I couldn't stop talking about them. And I always was the kind of person that would go to a craft beer bar. Back then, I think we just called everything microbrew, and
Yeah.
And I had young kids at the time too, and so it turns out that like going to brew pubs is actually like, if you're not in this scene, it might sound counterintuitive, but it's kind of perfect because for kids, they've got like the coloring pages and pretzels and root beers and whatever, and so we would always meet up with friends and family groups at like Four Peaks down in Tempe, where that was like the big deal years ago when we lived in the valley, and it was just like kind of something we'd do once a month or whatever. Well, this homebrew changed everything for me. And I couldn't stop talking about it. And that was like around Christmas time, 12 years ago. Well, I was working for the Phoenix Fire Department, actually retired with 20 years in the system in December. And I got home from the fire station on Father's Day, 6 months later, after I was introduced to this whole concept of homebrew. And my wife had a homebrew kit and a shelf and a refrigerator in the garage. And I was so excited. I made my first beer that day. And before that was done fermenting, I went to the local homebrew store and I said, "Hey, I want to make a Chimay clone and I want to make a mead." And I was introduced to mead like most people, especially years ago, where I happened to be at the Renaissance Fair with my family and was like, "I'll try one of those, like, kind of know what it is, never had it."
Sure.
And anyways, I just thought, hey, it's something I could maybe make. Well, let's see. So I with everything I read, it was going to take months to a year before it was going to be ready. So I thought, hey, I'm going to try and make something that'll be ready for Thanksgiving, 5 months down the road. And it turned out that my early meads were better than my early beers by kind of a long shot. So I thought, well, maybe I'm onto something here. And so that evolved into a passion where I was brewing, probably every other week, making a batch, and got into all grain brewing. And, I would probably make, 2 beers a month, maybe 3, and I would make maybe 1 mead a month or less. Cause I always thought it was going to take all this time, and it eventually figured out how to speed up that process commercially. We can talk about that later. But, yeah, I just got so into it, and I didn't have any friends that were homebrewing. Like everything I knew about was from the internet, from reading books and magazines, and I just kept applying all of my sort of passion to create new flavors to my homebrewing, because I had there were times where I would make a traditional style, but I always felt like if I'm going to spend all of this time, it's kind of like 10 hours over a couple of days, I want to do something that's different. And so I might get a porter recipe and put maple syrup in it, or age it on oak, or whatever it was, a little different. And I just kept running with that. And like any home brewer, I kept asking myself that question: what would it look like if I went pro one day? And I saw that the Siebel Institute, which, if you don't know, Siebel in Chicago and UC Davis are two of the best places in the country. Now, there's a lot of universities that have brewing programs, but especially then, those were kind of like the two spots if you wanted to become a professional brewer. And with my family commitments, my fire commitments, trying to promote at that job, going to a multi-month program, especially in Europe, was out of the question. But Siebel had this 3-day class called How to Start a Brewery. And I believe I attended the second one they ever put on. And I think that must have been 2010, November. Gosh, that's going back now.
Sure.
And I'd been homebrewing for a couple of years. And so I get to this class. There's 40 people in the class. And there were folks from Alaska, Panama, Canada. It was quite a diverse group as far as, regional representation. Some folks already had breweries that were there trying to, bring their business to the next level. And so the first question they asked was, who here is an award-winning home brewer? And everyone but me raised their hand. And I looked at the guy next to me and I said, they have awards for this stuff? Like, I just had no clue about like homebrew clubs or anything. And so beyond everything I learned at Siebel, which was incredible, and I highly recommend that program to anyone looking to get into the game professionally, I got home and I started entering my homebrew, mead, beer, cider, into contests, and started winning medals and getting really good feedback right away. So that was really nice validation. And so that really helped inspire me and boost some confidence as far as, hey, I kind of know what tastes good. I'm figuring out how to make these things. And I really thought, I would start a nano brewery. Well, part of this program, as far as getting started, involved my family and I moving to Prescott. So we were living in the valley and decided to try and raise our kids in this small town atmosphere, because my wife and I grew up on the East Coast in small towns. So we wound up leaving the big city. I was able to continue working for Phoenix Fire because I could drive down every third day for my 24-hour shift. So that was a bit of a commitment and a lifestyle change, but it was worth it for us. And within a month of moving here to this beautiful mountain town with only 40,000 people, we went to the closest local winery. It was called Juniper Well Ranch and Vineyards. And I brought some homebrew mead. And before I left, the owners invited us to make our mead there. And I said, well, that's really cool, because I was just about to start looking for a very small commercial space in town to do either like a nano brewery or a meadery. Well, it turned out that this opportunity just meshed perfectly with everything that we wanted to do. And I figured out that we could start an alternating proprietorship. And so this is something that anyone can do in the brewing world, or I believe, and definitely in the wine world, anywhere in the country. And we were able to establish the first alternating proprietorship in Arizona, and that's where one separate licensed winery rents or leases space from another. So there's like the host winery and the guest winery. So when we started about a year after meeting Dave and Linda from Juniper Well Ranch and Vineyards, and we were interning there basically, we helped them, we put all my homebrew skills into bottling wine, helping them crush and destem. We did everything but prune vines with those guys for about a year before everything got going, and we built up a good relationship because they had to change their federal winery permit to allow us to be in there. And that was, it's a big commitment. So It's kind of like being a business partner in a way, but not directly involved with each other's operations. So we were the first to do that in Arizona, which allowed me to put about 10 grand on one credit card and have 18 square feet of space to start our business. And so in 2012, when we started, we made about 300 gallons of mead and cider. We were the smallest winery in the state of Arizona. By the end of 2017, 2 expansions later, we made over 29,000 gallons and became the biggest winery in the history of our state, and had never made grape wine at the time either, which is kind of funny. So that's kind of the story on how we got going. And there's a lot of side stories and gaps in there, but we couldn't have started smaller. And legally, if anyone's listening that's a home brewer, I'm sure this will be interesting. As a winery, and I believe this is also true for brewing, but check me on this. You have to make like the minimum amount. There's a minimum. You have to make 200 gallons a year, which is the max any household's allowed to make as a home brewer. So it's kind of funny how those laws come into play.
That varies state by state, but you're right. There are a number of states that have that kind of minimum production, and there are. I've seen some around here. There was one up in the south end of Wyoming that actually had to shut because they weren't meeting the minimum production requirement for that license. As you envision this idea, it's for a meadery. You mentioned that your introduction to mead came out of that kind of Renaissance fair and kind of old school mead approach. But then you had this kind of history and background in experimentation with different ingredients coming out of that homebrew side. What was the inspiration to pull those together? Mead was still, even at the time that you're doing this, a pretty niche thing. I'd say it's probably even still a pretty niche product. But one of the major contributors to the higher profile of mead now has been yours and fellow mead makers really pushing a flavor-forward approach that moves past that, or embraces that tradition, and then moves it in an even more contemporary direction. Talk to me about that initial inspiration and how you kind of envisioned the products that you were going to make that was going to help mead and the mead that you make grow in a commercial sense.
That's a really good question. So I think that my wife and I have always been foodies at heart. even before we could ever afford some of the amazing meals we've had as we've gotten to travel and really learn about what some of the best in the world can be. And I think that was definitely a motivation, right? Is how do you piece together different spices, different ingredients when you're making a meal. And anyone that's homebrewed knows that, making beer is a lot like making soup, and you put all these different ingredients in there, some in the beginning, middle, or end, some after the soup's done, right? I don't know. That's just one analogy I used to try and explain to people what homebrewing is kind of like. And so you're trying to create this amazing product. In my mind, that's going to be diverse in its flavor profile. So when you take your first sip after you assess the aroma, it should change as it goes across your palate, and there should be a lasting finish, and it should be balanced, unless you're purposefully trying to have something that's so fruit forward or coffee forward or something. Maybe something isn't imbalanced. But for me, I want to have different flavors come together. I want them to be complex and change. I want them to be balanced. And I think that when you look at, I've always been interested in what makes something the best of its class. Whether it's a meal, a beer, in our case, making mead and cider. And I think that those are some of the common denominators across different disciplines, right? You've got these complex, different things coming together and integrating, and it's this kind of a drive to, people that are, in the like dog breeding world or raising horses, like they're always trying to make the best offspring they can with the best stock going in there. Like, I think that that's another analogy. There's all of these different pursuits you can have in life to try and achieve perfection or something that's as good as it can be or whatnot. And so I've always been driven like that, and I feel like I was never really like the best at anything in my life. I always, sort of a jack of all trades, trying different things and learning. But when it came to mead, I just applied every bit of focus I could and every bit of inspiration to try and make these different products that can stand as on their own, next to any wine or port or spirit or beer, as being outstanding examples of the craft. And so I guess I'm driven by that in a way, and I know that my staff are as well. And so we're applying ourselves, our creativity and imagination every day to try and come up with these new flavors. And right now, I looked at Untapped the other day, and we've got over 270 different entries on there, and that's in 8 years. And a lot of those are super small batches, and we're still doing that. We're still doing extreme home brewing in our test batches, which is kind of fun, even
Right.
though we're now doing 60 barrel, 2,000 gallon batches of cider at the same time. And I think that and we're all homebrewers at Superstition in production. Everyone started that way, and some of our folks still do. And I think that passion, that not being afraid to try anything at a small level to see what you get is just really important to what we do. And when you look at a traditional mead, honey, water, and yeast, defining that, it's beautiful. You can make amazing traditional meads that are dry, semi-sweet or sweet. They can have different alcohol levels. They can be made with different honeys that can be just as different as choosing different grains or hops or choosing different wine grape varietals. And you can have a beautiful expression of the terroir of a place and what the bees were doing at a particular time or season. And that's great. And whenever we have the opportunity to get a unique honey, we often will take at least part of that and try and make a traditional mead and see what comes out. I think a traditional mead's kind of like, a lager or a pilsner for a mead maker, where there's especially if it's dry, there's nowhere to hide anything. I mean, your technique has to be perfect, and that's cool, and we do that. But as much as I love drinking a pilsner, especially after a beer fest when you've been chugging, crazy imperial stouts and sours for 2 days, and that's kind of all a brewer wants at that point, right? Or mead maker in our case too. I think the world would be a little boring if that's all that you had. If you had only been exposed to one style of beer or one style of mead or wine or ate one kind of food, your life would be pretty darn boring. So for me, I think taking inspiration from what craft beer's done, what's going on with the food world now, even what wine and spirits are doing. I mean, people are being so creative and pushing the boundaries, so much so that quite often the government doesn't even know what to do with our labels, and we have to argue our stance. So I think that's something I did right from the beginning, and I couldn't imagine not doing that. And that's applying like anything that inspires you, trying to duplicate a peanut butter jelly sandwich or an apple pie in a liquid format, taking different things that, some of our friends have done and collabs and trying to say, okay, let's see if we can make like a mead version that actually tastes kind of like a beer, there's just so many things and then our barrel program, we can talk about that later.
Sure.
That's just, I just geek out on that to no end.
Yeah, I think when you start talking about being the best at something, I think there's two different directions. There's that being novel and being an initial first mover, and then there is that incredible process of iteration and fine tuning, tweaking, and and building best over a long period of time. And it seems like both of those are part of your process in some way or another, by coming out with or taking this kind of more flavorful approach. You and several other mead maker contemporaries have kind of pushed the conversation in that direction. But the other key piece of that is also fine tuning. I want to talk to you a little bit more about that in a second. But first, this episode is brought to you by Hopsteiner, your premium hop supplier dedicated to delivering quality hops and hops products in every package. Visit hopsteiner.com for a complete list of offerings or select shop hops to start ordering today. Also, born out of a basement in Milwaukee a decade ago, Spike has grown to become a leading manufacturer of premium quality brewing equipment. So if you're looking for a reliable system for home or a commercial grade nano system for your brewery, this is the time to buy. Spike is offering craft beer and brewing listeners a special 10% off all 3-vessel system purchases while supplies last. Visit spikebrewing.com/craft and enter the code CBB at checkout. Spike Brewing, pursue what's possible. So as I was mentioning before, I think, both of those things of coming up with the idea and something novel, but then also tweaking and fine tuning that so that it stays the best. Any first mover has a short window of time to be the best if they create something. But holding on to that position and being considered in that conversation of best over a longer period of time means that you have to stay there. And that is a whole nother challenge. Talk to me a little bit about, as you started making mead, how you were able to take those ideas and improve execution and fine tune so that you could achieve the vision for flavor that you had when you started making these.
That's a good question too. I would agree with you that the pressure to retain the relevance you've worked so hard to establish is ever present, and that comes up when we'll do a SWOT analysis, and that's where you analyze your strengths, your weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as they pertain to your business and maybe what you're doing in a particular market or a particular aspect. But we do those sorts of things a couple times a year at our company, and relevance always comes up. How do we continue to maintain relevance? And so you have to, as a business in the craft industry, have the pulse of trends and know what's going on. I think a good example of that, our production manager was passionate about doing a milkshake IPA inspired mead as we were getting into cans. And I don't know, as maybe a traditionalist, if you told me 3 years ago I would be putting my product in cans, it would have taken me a minute to stop laughing. But as a business person and as someone that sees how the world's changing and the customers are asking for these different packaging formats, I would have been a dinosaur if I didn't evolve with that. And so we thought, hey, for our first mead in a can, let's do something crazy. Let's make it fun. And so we came up with Backseat Bingo, sort of a 50s nod with the thematic design as well, to like a Shake Shack. And so this is kind of like an Orange Julius in a can, carbonated, delicious, super refreshing, on the sweet side, as most meads happen to be. And it was our fastest selling product we ever had released. We came out with our third can mead 2 weeks ago that's just like a mimosa in a can called Bimosa. It's just honey and orange juice in there. And we had 7,500 cans allocated in a day. So by observing trends in this case cans and milkshake IPAs and doing our version of that in mead form, you're able to stay relevant. And I know that the margins for us as a business, and I know that the ratings are never going to be as high on those products, and that's okay. We're always going to do our crazy, multi-year barrel aged things that come out, and that's where a lot of my passion lies. But I also love these cans we're coming out with. So by maintaining a good assessment of the industry, you can keep up with these trends and stay relevant. Another thing is that we'll take cues from these different parallel industries. So, for example, in our tasting room, I try and put myself in the mindset of you're behind the bar in the tasting room, which I used to do plenty. And customer comes in and says, "Oh, I don't know what mead is," which is probably most customers for sure. What we do is largely unknown to everyone, especially outside of the craft beer world. And what we do is expensive to make, expensive to sell, and we've taken that, which is our greatest challenge, and turned it into our greatest opportunity, which is we get to define what mead is to so many people, along with, like you said, a few of our contemporaries out there that are pushing the limits and making some amazing products. So if you come in and you say that to me, I would say, all right, well, what do you like to drink? And if you said beer, I'd say, okay, well, we have a couple of meads on tap right now that have hops in them. And all of a sudden, you've established a connection in the mind of the consumer that knows what, like maybe they've never really seen a hop unless they're a home brewer, right? But they're like, okay, cool, I know what hops are. I've heard about that on television commercials.
Exactly,
I know that's in beer.
sure.
And we go, hey, try these hopped meads. And then if someone's like, hey, I'm a bourbon drinker. Oh, cool. Well, you know what? We've got this Arizona mesquite honey that we put into bourbon barrels, and you can smell and taste the bourbon, but it won't burn because it's only 15% the way it worked, but it's amazing. And then if you're like, yeah, I drink wine. Well, cool. We have this whole line of products that we call piments in the mead world, and a piment is when you ferment wine grapes with honey. So a lot of times by trying to figure out how can I make something that's marketable, meaning I can make a connection in the mind of the consumer that's unfamiliar with mead, that also drives innovation with us. And now we have white piments with hops in them. I mean, we start combining all of this stuff, and it just gives people that come in to visit us a reason to get excited about what we're doing, to get interested in what we're doing, to share our passion. And I think that by always doing that and evolving what happens in that world, always picking out new barrels. I mean, we've done mead aged in American brandy. We've got a cherry mead with cherry juice. We import it from Frederiksdal, the best cherry wine producer, and they have an orchard in the world in Denmark. So we've got these Frederiksdal cherries. We've put Arizona honey in there, and now we've got those in. No one knows this yet, but American cherry brandy barrels. And we put Arizona organic apple cider in with the cherry juice and we ferment it. So we've also got apple brandy barrels. We're going to be doing this line, or sort of a grouping, right, where you're going to have these three bottles where we've got, okay, the apple brandy one, the cherry brandy one, and then we'll blend of both. And when that comes out, I pulled a nail on the cherry brandy barrel the other day with our production manager. It's amazing. It's one of the best things we've ever made. I mean, who's combined all those different, I mean, they're conceptually related, but like the reality of acquiring, sourcing all this stuff from around the world, these barrels, and making this happen. And that's a great story. And more importantly, it's delicious. And when people get to try this, it's going to be so much fun. And so that stuff's happening all the time.
Yeah. Let me talk about that innovation process for a little bit. Obviously, you are pushing limits. You are making new things. You are envisioning things. But you're dealing with a lot of very expensive raw ingredients. Honey is not cheap. Frederiksdal cherries are absolutely not cheap. This is, there's not a lot of room for error on this because no one wants to have something go the wrong way. As you all envision this within the production team, within the mead making team, what does that innovation process look like? Where do the ideas come from? What's that process of testing some ideas before you fully commit? What kind of bench testing do you do? How does it move through your innovation process and then ultimately get greenlit?
That's a really good question. All right, so let's talk about bench trials for a minute. So we have this series called the White Series, where we have vanilla and white chocolate aged in new American oak and different fruits. So it started with berry white, which is raspberries and white chocolate, and then we got into blueberry white, etc. And so we haven't introduced a new White Series flavor in a couple of years. And back to that idea of relevance and keeping people excited, keeping the hype going around a product or a line, we're going to do something, and we have not announced this to anyone yet. We did bench trials, and we've come up with 2 brand new flavors for the White Series that'll be, they're in barrels right now. We haven't normally this would all come out in November. The whole COVID deals pushed our time frame forwards, and for at least a couple of months. But long story short, we did this bench trial process where we got a dozen different juices, and we took our base, right, so we could mix that in and then see how it tastes. And so that's done at the wine glass level. I mean, that's bench trialing it to the tune of ounces at a time and splitting that up, right? And we went through all of these different flavors, and we decided that our next fruit in the white series is going to be mulberry. So we're going to have a mulberry white mead coming out, and it's amazing. It's kind of got the smoothness of blueberry white and almost the tartness of blackberry white, but somewhere in the middle, and it's this perfect fruit flavor. It's an amazing pairing. But we tried all of these other fruits, right? And some of them were really good, but that mulberry just stood out as the best. And so that's done just by mixing things together. And then we do test batches. And so we have 15-gallon, just like when you kind of get a little more advanced into homebrewing, you may buy yourself, a half-barrel conical. So we have a couple of those. We also have about 10 or so 80-gallon fermenters that at one point was the biggest size that we had,
Right,
and now it's
right.
something that will be probably the smallest size commercial batch that we do. I mean, some of those 15-gallon batches will turn into, say, 2.5 kegs that we put on tap and we'll test out as well to the customers in our tasting room. But when it comes to that level, our production staff and anyone that works at Superstition, I don't care what you do, if you've got an idea for a mead or cider, you can go bring it up at a staff meeting, work with our production staff. Anyone can make anything they can envision. I don't care what it costs, at least at that size. And so some companies, I think, and I have a lot of friends that do this, they really promote innovation amongst their staff. And I think not only does that get you buy-in from your folks, when you've got someone that works in the tasting room that says, hey, I helped put that label on, I came up with this idea, I came up with part of this name. It's such a great way to bring people together. And it's a way to, I mean, when you have 270 products, let's be honest, it's hard to come up with really good new names. I mean, so many things that we call like the untapped test, we're like, all right, let's run, oh, no, that's taken. And so by bringing everyone to, I mean, we do this every Tuesday afternoon, by the way. We go through like our sales and production meeting, and there's usually a time where I'm like, all right, we've got these 3 new things. We think they're coming out in August or September. We need a name for this and this. And then we just start talking about different ideas. Oftentimes there's a little bit of liquid inspiration there at those meetings, which is cool.
Sure.
And yeah, that's kind of how that goes. But I think the big question is, how do you not mess it up, right? Especially when you're going to throw some spaghetti on the wall to the tune of thousands of dollars or more in a batch. And I think you have to have proven concepts, and anyone does by the time you get to this point. But that took years and years of trial and development. I mean, from my home brewing to starting commercially, eventually you're going to run through all of these different yeast strains, probably, right? Whether it's a brewery or a meadery. And I've got to think everyone goes through a lot of the same stuff. You're going to try different temperatures of fermentation. You're going to get better equipment, and you're going to be able to control those temperatures. You're going to figure out about, all of these different aspects and nutrient regimes that help you have a happy, healthy fermentation. You're going to eventually upscale as at least commercially, but I think that home brewing analogy is the same too. You can keep getting better quality equipment, better ways to bottle and package whatever you're doing to increase quality, which ultimately is going to help the aging process, right? I mean, our bottling line now, it's amazing what that thing can do. I mean, compared to how we first started with a gravity filler, now, I mean, our bottles are getting rinsed and gassed and filled and purged of any ambient air. I mean, the ability to, and we use like the highest quality corks and caps and all of that stuff. So when you don't spare any expense in the ingredients that you're choosing, or the packaging or the equipment, you do the very best that you can afford as a home brewer or as a company, then you're going to make the best product you can. And if you just keep pushing that forwards and investing, in our case, through loans that are astronomical to us at this time, it's still amazing what we've accomplished. You just keep upping the game of quality, and that's super important. That is always at the top of our mind.
I want to talk to you about specific ingredients and some process. Before we do that, this episode is brought to you by Brewers Publications, publishers of Goza, Bring a Classic German Beer for the Modern Era by Fal Allen. Goza explores the history of this lightly sour wheat beer style, its traditional ingredients, and special brewing techniques. Learn about salinity, spices, and lactic acid as you experiment with Goza recipes from some of the best-known craft brewers of our time. Also, Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions give you a year of the print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, a special deep dive email only for All Access subscribers, premium content, and All Access exclusive merchandise. Go to beerandbrewing.com and click on the subscribe button to join now. So ingredients and process. You mentioned earlier that you found a means of speeding up the mead process. I know you've mentioned before in the Breakout Brewer and Craft Beer and Brewing magazine that you expected when you started making mead to have to sit around for years and years until off flavors wore off. It's been kind of a common trope with mead in general that it's a long process to have it clean itself up and make for something drinkable. Obviously, if you were trying to make one by Thanksgiving and get it done in 5 months, that's a whole different kind of time frame. And at a commercial scale, sitting on something for 4 years, no one does that. No one in the beer world, no one in the wine world, no one, other than some bourbon producers or, Scotch producers, cares to age any product for that kind of length. And when you do, obviously everything gets more expensive. Talk to me a little bit about your initial foray into that and how you kind of solved some of that mead making problem of time.
Sure. So when I got started 8 years ago, there was very little information out there. Vicky Rowe that runs gotmead.com, if anyone's listening and is interested in making mead, that's a great resource. Tons of recipes, lots of great information, some really talented people contributing on there. Last time I checked, it was like $25 or $50 a year to join to get access to all this information. So I found Got Mead. I had Ken Schramm's book, The Complete Mead Maker. That's the classic homebrewing book on mead, and started trying to figure out how do I make this stuff better, right? And so everything starts with really good ingredients, but what was becoming popularly known and even shared on the internet and in forums at the time, again 7-8 years ago, was staggered nutrient additions, or how do you manage a fermentation. And so one of the big differences between beer, wine, and mead making is that it's critical to manage our fermentation. And the idea is that a traditional mead with honey, water, and yeast doesn't have enough nutrients to keep the yeast optimally healthy in that environment. And so as yeast begins to do its work, there are different stressors that occur. And so an obvious one is alcohol, right? We all, as home brewers, look at the specs for a particular yeast strain, and it'll say, oh, this can ferment 12 to 14% or whatever that yeast strain can do. Well, when you get to the higher limit of that, the yeast is going to be pretty stressed, and that's where off flavors are going to be created. This one way, right? So you want to reduce the stress in the fermentation, and you want to provide nutrients. So yeast nutrients, yeast energizers, whatever your homebrew store has and whatever it says is recommended on that. I started doing that as a home brewer, and that scaled up nicely when it came to doing my stuff commercially. And it doesn't mean that people don't do this in beer and wine. There's definitely examples of it, but it's definitely integral to making mead. So if you're doing something that has fruit in the beginning or at some point in the fermentation, there's probably going to be some really great nutrients from those fruits going in that are going to be beneficial to the yeast and that fermentation. And so that's a great thing. But a lot of times you're going to be putting in your special ingredients in secondary or after your primary fermentation is all done. So especially in that case, well, you can certainly hide things or have, all flavors sort of blend or age out quicker, it would seem, by having different ingredients. You want to avoid that in the first place. And so when I was a paramedic and wound up acquiring an old oxygen tank and regulator, and that made a world of difference beyond what you can introduce by stirring in the beginning, say when you're mixing up a batch of, parts per million oxygen, by taking an O2 stone and having pure medical or food grade oxygen, which you can go buy food grade oxygen tanks at, most like welding gas supply stores. So when it's food grade oxygen, they filter the gas so that there's no oil or contaminants in there. So anyways, by putting food grade oxygen into the first third of your fermentation, you're going to help the yeast grow the acrospore it needs when it's beginning that phase of its life cycle, preparing for mitosis. And that's one way that yeast will scrub oxygen out of wort or must when it's going through that process. You do not want to give it oxygen after that's done. And the different, there's these billions and billions of cells in your fermentation. They're not all going to be at the exact same space in time. So what we do is we'll give that food grade oxygen gone through a stone to bring the micron size down so it's assimilable by the yeast. We'll do that for the first third of fermentation. And so if someone's getting way into home brewing, then that might be worth your, a couple $100 to pick up a tank and get your O2 stones really cheap, and then getting it filled cheap. So it's just another piece of equipment to invest in. If you don't have that, just by stirring, or degassing, which is, all right, this is kind of the same thing, and this is important. And it's not something I ever thought about. Well, I mean, in the beginning, right, until I heard this. But degassing is stirring your fermentation to disrupt the CO2 and have it come out. So we all have, blow off tubes or an airlock or whatever, and you see the CO2 leaving. Well, when you shake a carboy, or in our case, pump the liquid in and back out to another valve, you are disrupting the CO2, and it's going to come. I mean, you're going to get not all of it, but the bulk of the CO2 out in this process of just stirring. So at the homebrew level, you can buy drill with a paddle bit that kind of folds up at the end, and don't get greedy, because as soon as you get greedy, you're going to have a volcano coming out of your fermenter, it's just going to happen, has to. But by doing that, you're degassing. So, CO2, while it's something we want in the end product of anything carbonated, it's actually toxic as far as the yeast is concerned. It's unhealthy for the yeast. So by removing the CO2 or degassing, you're going to help provide this optimal environment for fermentation. Again, keeping the yeast less stressed. So we're degassing for the first half of fermentation. We're going to add nutrients for the first half of fermentation. We're going to add oxygen for the first third of fermentation. And then there are also other nutrients you can get at the homebrew store that you can put in after halfway if you want, especially if something's getting to be really high gravity. Something else I started doing early on was, if I was going to be over about 14% ABV for my goal for this product, I would double pitch. And so you want to put in, a little more yeast than you need for something that would be a sessionable product, for example. So enough yeast, treating it the right way during fermentation. Those are all just critical steps that, the oxygen thing is an expense, but otherwise anyone can do any of those other things, and you can make delicious, perfect mead by sticking to that. Now, I did skip over sanitation. That goes without saying, but anyone that's a home brewer is going to bring that to play, because we're not using any heat in our product. It's all cold side brewing. So anything that touches your product has to be clean and sanitized. But you go through those other sorts of steps, and anyone can make delicious traditional mead, in 4 weeks. It might not be the most interesting thing. There's certainly still a benefit to time when it comes to different things integrating. Maybe there's something just a little bit off, and that's going to fade, but it's so much better than being, significantly off. So another part of that theory is, when yeast is finally done and it's aggregating, flocculating, settling down, some of those cells are going to rupture. And so that's when some of those off flavors can be released during autolysis. So by pumping or racking in the wine world, by racking off of your yeast as soon as primary fermentation is done, that's something else that's important. And then there's fining and filtering. Again, there's all different levels of this that you do as a home brewer. I would say read the directions, because I know I didn't a couple times. And it was this fining isn't working. But as a home brewer, you're always concerned that if you fine or filter, you're going to lose flavor, right? Well, if you do it right, in the wine world, filtering can actually be referred to as polishing. You can help kind of get something that's maybe not ideal out of there just by filtering it. Since I started filtering, I've never had, well, in like one case, I'm thinking we actually had to change the name of a product because the flavor did change significantly when we filtered it. But almost with one exception, I'd say out of hundreds of times that we filtered things, it actually just kind of gets better. So don't be afraid to, follow the instructions on fining. And if you get into, like a Buen Vino, like 3-plate, filter as a home brewer. I mean, that's great. I used that for commercial batches for years and I used to have just boxes of like hundreds of those pads because that was not meant for what we were doing.
Sure.
But yeah, that's another thing as far as quality goes. And again, as you scale up, you can invest more, whether you're home brewing or commercial, just in better equipment, and then it just things become easier. You can move bigger volumes through whatever your equipment is.
With yeast itself, do you settled on a single strain? Do you is it based on the goal for any individual mead? Do you keep a couple of different lines going for contextual stuff, or do you have a workhorse that you depend on consistently?
That's a good question. I would say yes to all of those questions. We do have a house yeast. I would recommend that people out there interested in making mead that's similar to our style experiment with different strains of yeast that are designed for white wine specifically, but we also have strains of yeast that were designed for red wine, and we've done ale yeast. We've co-fermented with Saison yeast and our house yeast. We've used Whitbread ale yeast. I haven't actually used a Belgian strain yet. That's on my list. It's been on my list for 8 years and just haven't done that.
Sure.
There are, but I mean, there's plenty of beer yeast that'll be awesome for meads, plenty of wine yeast. So yeah, it really does depend on the product, but we do have a house strain, and that's one of 2 or 3 proprietary things that we have at Superstition, because I worked so hard for years trying everything out there. And I think that what we make really does have a slightly unique flavor profile compared to a lot of even other great meads that are out there. And so I'm pretty happy with that.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about honey. From a traditional mead standpoint, obviously honey variety has a humongous impact on flavor. Talk to me a little bit about your honey selection based on what the end result goal is for specific meads.
Cool. So when I started this company, I learned a couple of things and just used logic and reason as best as I could, thinking, all right, if I'm going to, for example, make a product and I want to be able to go from 5 gallons in this test batch and one day make 1,000 gallons, I'm going to have to be able to rely on the ingredients being the same down the road at that level. And so I asked the question, what is the most available type of local honey we can get? And so there's 2 answers to that. So in Arizona, wildflower honey, and if you're listening and don't know, wildflower honey means that it's either a blend of different honeys or that there's not a single nectar source the bees were predominantly going to acquire their nectar. So wildflower honey can be a lot of different things. I've never had, on that note, a bad honey. I've had weird honeys, but our wildflower honey, I would just describe it as like a classic honey flavor, and it's kind of a great palette for anything that we do. But the other thing that's a bit unique to Arizona and the Southwest is mesquite honey. And mesquite is not a barbecue flavor. It's actually a tree that grows in the desert, and it flowers, and there's so many of these mesquite bosques, that's the Spanish word for forest, that are along dry riverbeds in Arizona, and beekeepers will go there, and it makes amazing honey. And it has a spicy character to it that stands out from the wildflower honey. And so sometimes we'll be thinking about a particular fruit or an herb or a barrel that maybe this bit of spice would be complementary with. So when we make Lager Mas de Oro, that's usually, like when I go into our tasting room, my staff hands me a glass of that every time I walk in. And that's our bone dry, 15% usually Arizona mesquite honey traditional mead that we age in bourbon barrels. And I love it. I love it chilled like white wine temperature. It's so refreshing, but that spicy character of the honey, and it's subtle, but it's there. It just goes great with that bourbon character you're pulling out of the staves. So we will try and align, either like for when we do vanilla beans, I don't necessarily want that spiciness. I want that smoothness of the wildflower honey. So that's what we'll use for Tahitian honeymoon. And sometimes if you're using like a crazy amount of adjuncts, you're going to overpower what that honey is going to do anyway. Sure. It just depends. There's also, you take price into account with that. Now, everything that anyone's ever seen from Superstition in a bottle that's a mead has been made with Arizona honey. When we came up with our canned line, I wanted to design a product that would be positioned on the shelf comparable to a double IPA. So you can get our canned meads for $5.50 to $6 for a 16-ounce can on the shelf. But in order to do that and still have it make sense for us as a company, we couldn't use Arizona honey. It's too expensive. So we tested different international honeys. And so we have honey from Brazil and honey from India that is delicious. It's from our same supplier, Crockett's Honey in Tempe, but because they do buy international honeys as well. They have that available. Bee Seasonal has it available. They're a great company to get honey from if you're listening. And so we've bought from both of those guys these international honeys, and we've figured out what works in a delicious way for our canned mead. So and because our canned meads have so many different flavors that we're going crazy. Like you may see a traditional canned mead from us one day. There's a reason why we would do that with taxes as well. But our point is to do some really cool, crazy flavors in our cans. And so because we're doing that, the honey, while it's still important, and that's where the majority, or in some cases all of the fermentable sugars coming from, we're using so many adjuncts that the honey takes a back seat in a way, or at least it's kind of driving at the same time. So yeah, that's it's definitely important to choose like a cool honey, but it's never more important than with a traditional mead. Sure. And as you get into barrels, you may want to think what character this wood or this barrel is going to provide, what honey is going to align with that. But that's kind of the story of us and honey.
How much variation in terms of how honey performs in the production, in the process of mead making, is involved there? I mean, when we talk to brewers, there's certain new malts, new hop crop years of hops, all can have performance impacts, and there's some variation that they have to pay attention to. For you, coming at it from a mead maker's perspective, do you see a difference between different types of honey, or is there a measurable way of predicting based on what the gravity of that honey is, or the other kind of metrics that you use to understand how this specific honey might perform through your process?
That's a good question too. All right, so when you're talking about the sugar content, honeys will vary to some degree by their moisture and sugar content. So when you look at the honey that we're dealing with, and I think this is true for most honeys, right? So think about you're making a homebrew batch of 5 gallons, and you take 1 gallon of honey, that would be 12 pounds. And you're going to use, so you got this gallon of honey, you got 4 gallons of water, you mix it up, you've got a 5-gallon batch of mead. Every pound of honey in every 5 gallons of that mixture will equal 1% ABV if you ferment it dry. And that scales up. So that can change a little bit. And you're not going to really know that until you mix up your honey, right? And you could do that side by side, and it's going to vary a touch. But for the most part, that's a really good way to look at recipes and as far as like the sort of alcohol content you're going to get from honey. Now, there's a honey that's very, I don't know if you can, it's almost impossible to get in America, but Melipona bees are stingless bees in Central and South America. And so I'm a partner in a Brazilian meadery, and we're about to start using Melipona honey there. And these bees, instead of making like, say, 60 to 100 pounds of honey a year like Arizona bees can do, they make about 5 pounds a year. Oof. So it's super expensive. And even in Brazil. And it's like the moisture, it's ridiculous. All right, so when you measure,
Kopi Luwak of
totally,
honey.
yeah, this, yeah, and I know a friend of mine, Carvin Wilson, is one of the most talented homebrew mead makers in the world. He actually said that he made a homebrew mead with this. But this Melipona honey is so unique; it pours out kind of like Aunt Jemima syrup. Like, I mean, it's got that like consistency to it. Like, it just pours. It's not like honey that kind of drips, right?
Yeah.
And the sugar content, when we've measured it, is actually higher than our Arizona honey. And so there are completely different species of bees. I mean, there's over 400 Melipona species themselves making these honeys. But again, that's kind of a weird rabbit hole to go down. But for the most part, the honey you're going to buy here, it's going to have a pretty consistent sugar content, a pretty consistent moisture content. Bees actually know that they have to get the moisture content below about 18% in the hive, and they line up and flap their wings to dry it out before they seal it in the honeycomb. That way, that's how they stabilize it. And so it's hyperosmotic, right? Like, there's so much pressure, osmotic pressure in that honey that the yeast and bacteria that's in the air around us can't ferment it, or else bees would be making mead themselves, right?
For sure.
So then there's just, okay, what nectar source did the bees go to get this honey? You're going to actually have like citrus aromas and flavors in orange blossom honey. That's really kind of cool. And so when you're designing a recipe, you take that into consideration. And so all these different honeys are going to have different flavor and aroma profiles, which is part of the fun of the game. A really cool example is when you caramelize honey, you can use that, and that would be making a style of mead called a bochet. And so when you cook honey, which we've done as well, and we've done that for primary fermentation, we've also blended that in for back sweetening in secondary. Well, you're going to have caramel and marshmallow flavors coming out. That's just amazing. So you can chemically change the honey just by cooking it. It's a lot like when you caramelize onions at home, a raw onion, well, it might be good in guacamole or salsa. Once you cook that thing and it gets like, you don't want to put raw onions on a steak, but man, you cook those things and they're delicious and sweet. So yeah, you can change the way your honey tastes yourself.
That's awesome. Let's talk about ingredients and the way that you add them to your mead. So you get through your mead making process, you've got your base mead. Where, as you start adding, and say something like a berry-based mead, where does the ingredient addition come into that process? Or do you do it while they're on a secondary process after you've pulled yeast off? I assume with that kind of high alcohol that you don't reuse yeast as you might otherwise do in a brewing world. And so that kind of, contamination process is not as important of a consideration. Or is there some benefit to still having some fermentation going on while you do this? Talk to me a little bit about some of the different ingredients you use and how they play into the process.
Good question. So to answer the yeast question, we use fresh, dry yeast that we rehydrate for every fermentation. We've used some liquid yeast, like when we use ale yeast, for example, when co-fermenting, but the vast majority of what we do is a brand new pitch every time. It costs a little more money than reusing yeast, but again, that's one of the variables of repeatability that we want to handle ourselves. So we're managing that by using fresh yeast. So again, investing in the front end of your product is important. Not that that's the only way to do it. I'm sure there's lots of folks that you can harvest yeast. That would be a fun thing to do. So that's the yeast piece of that. When it comes to adding fruit, now when we do a piment or when we do a cider, which is apple cider and honey fermented together, we did a session mead where we added some water to bring the ABV down of the grape juice. But for anything that's ever been in a bottle, there's no water there. Right? All the liquids coming from the fruit juice. And if you do that much fruit contribution on the front end of a fermentation, it's going to translate into the flavor on the back end. A lot of times if you don't take that approach and you skimp on the amount of fruit that goes into the front end and you don't do anything during fermentation or after, you may not get the fruit character that you're looking for. So remember that during fermentation, a lot of that is going to blow off through, the CO2 leaving your product. It's going to carry, these chemical compounds that would contribute to aroma and flavor with it. And so you have to sort of overload it in a way in the front if you really want that to shine through. And when you drink our piments or ciders, you don't have to use your imagination to know that it's coming from this apple or grape base. So that's one example. Another example is you could do a traditional mead, and you could take whole fruit that you chop up. Like one thing that we do once a year, we're not going to do it this year for the first time. Long story short, production schedule, COVID and whatnot, but we'll get back into it next year. But several times now, we've gotten Masamoto peaches from California, and they're a famous orchard, and they provide some of the most interesting fruit to especially sours across California. And so we took these Masamoto Suncrest peaches and we froze them with liquid nitrogen. And we did that part just to have fun, and we got to make beer ice cream on the side. But we were breaking down cell walls with immediately freezing and in some ways perhaps even disinfecting what could be on the fruit, right? And we put all of that into a sanitized sack and just dunked this giant bag in an 80-gallon fermenter and just left it for months. And so, alcohol is a solvent and it's going to extract some of those fruit flavors. So you can just put in fruit in secondary. But if you're going to do that, you've got to use a lot of fruit to really get a fruit-forward mead. Now, you may want to balance that with some other ingredients. You may want to have the honey shine a little bit more than the fruit does. And we've done all those different things. We'll even put fruit juice in or whole fruit during the middle or at the end of fermentation so that we know that it's not going to pull off all of the aroma and flavor that we want to retain. Sometimes we'll even take fruit and just shove it in a barrel with a funnel. I talked to a friend of mine who's the president of our local Whiskey Row homebrew club here in Prescott yesterday on the phone. And we were catching up because once a year he goes to Colorado and brings us back 112 pounds of frozen tart Colorado pie cherries from a roadside stand. And when we get those, we usually just shove them into a barrel with like a really cool mead that's doing something else. And that makes a big mess when you're racking that barrel and requires a little more work on the back end. So anyways, my point is that from whole fruit, we've got a wine press. We've got a fruit crusher destemmer. We do wine from scratch with grapes delivered overnight from California. We've used Arizona grapes. We've done that with blackberries and cherries. I mean, there's so many different ways that you can put fruit into a product, from the beginning, the middle, the end, in a barrel after, and we've done all of that. So those are all really dependent on the recipe and your goals. And for us in production, oftentimes just like logistics, right? How does this work into our production schedule and when does it get here? So a lot of times those decisions are made on the fly, and that's how we come up with really fun one-off things. And a lot of times we plan it a year out. And then when you talk about other ingredients, something I learned from my buddy Derek, who's a brewer owner at Moxa Brewing right now, is using a hop back to infuse different flavors. When he was brewing at Abnormal, we went out and did this awesome collab. I brought him a bucket of Arizona mesquite honey, made this crazy stout, and he was showing me how you can put, not just hops, but cacao nibs, vanilla beans, coffee into this hop back and circulate it. And so when I was home brewing, and even when I started commercially, I would shove vanilla beans in a barrel to make Tahitian honeymoon, and 6-8 weeks later it started tasting like vanilla and you were stoked. Well, now we'll put vanilla beans in a hop back and we can set our pump on a really low setting and come back in 2 days and it's like vanilla, better than ever before. And so you go from 8 weeks to 2 days. So that's something that you could probably rig up as a home brewer as well, is figure out how to have a small hop back. And so there's so many things you can put in there that won't dissolve and break up. Anything that will kind of dissolve or break up or get funky, like especially like whole fruit additions, I'd recommend using like sanitized nylon sack or whatnot, or hop sock. So yeah.
On a homebrew scale, you have to also be really careful about oxygen ingress and that kind of thing, because the pumps that are available for homebrewers may not quite work at the standard that professional and commercial brewers and mead makers have access to. But that recirculation process has grown increasingly important, whether it's in dry hopping or whether it's in fruit additions or sugar additions or whatnot. And obviously these ingredients are expensive, and people want to, consumers, when they buy something, they want to feel the impact of that, and to get that maximum pop. That can be a great way to do it. Talk to me a little bit about, so last night, in order to do some research for this podcast, I grabbed a bottle of Juicius Caesar and a bottle of Vanilla Marion, and I was struck by the blend of berries in a mead like Vanilla Marion, and also the way that you envision this kind of vanilla along with these berries to accomplish certain flavor goals. Talk to me about how you envision that, and then build that kind of blend from a sensory perspective to achieve a flavor goal like that.
All right, that's a good question. So this kind of goes back, when you're talking about vanilla and berries, to how we came up with the White Series. And it was a happy accident. And so my wife and I, we're still 50-50 business partners. Her name's Jen to this day. And back in the beginning, we would bench trial by ourselves because there was no one else. And I had made Tahitian honeymoon, and there was way too much vanilla in there. And when you leave vanilla beans in something for too long, you start to get some bitterness from the husk. And we decided, okay, this might get better, in 6 months or whatever. But how can we take this crazy, overpowering vanilla flavor and turn it into something that we can use as a product? And started asking ourselves that question: what goes with vanilla? And well, we thought, wow, white chocolate. So we tried every preparation of white chocolate we could find. We already knew, and vanilla is, pretty much what defines white
Right,
chocolate and the
right.
flavor anyways. And we're like, well, what would you have white chocolate with? And we're like, well, I mean, like dark fruit just sounds perfect. Like you're thinking about pies and torts and, maybe some craft cocktails that we've had. Like those flavors just go together great. And so we started messing around with different fruit juices, different white chocolates, and we were able to figure out this amazing combination, this recipe that created the White series. And so we have really embraced vanilla and different dark fruits in a lot of the products that we do over the years. It doesn't always work out. Like cherries, for example, are kind of finicky, where like just cherry and honey by itself, probably going to knock it out of the park. You start putting other things in, and it's either going to be amazing or medicinal, right? And I remember one time I was like mixing up some Belgian dark candy sugar with a cherry mead just to see what it would be like. And I was like, this is so good. I can taste everything. It's like a little caramel, a little this and that. And this is when our production facility was in our current tasting room in Prescott. And I took some glasses of this out to some customers. I was like, hey, who wants to try this new thing we just whipped up? And I remember this gal took a sip and made this awful face, and she goes, Robitussin. And I tried, I went, you're right. This tastes like cough medicine. And it's because cherry is such a prevalent flavor in cough medicine that as soon as you add it, this other kind of caramel and this little twang that was like, it was like, okay, I can't do this. But there are other things that go great with cherries. Like we've done coffee and almonds with a cherry mead as a Moster collab that was out of this world. And so, man, cherries can go really either way, right? But dark fruit and vanilla, it just goes together. It's like a perfect pairing of flavors.
How do you kind of tweak the fine edges on that, though? One of the things that struck me about just tasting it was the way that it almost had a Pinot Noir character to it, with a little like barrel edge. Vanilla adding that kind of wood-aged vanillan character to it. Certainly had a little more sweetness than a typical Pinot Noir, but that kind of dark berry note didn't come across necessarily as sweet berry as much as it came through as, almost this berry flavor filtered through a wine type filter. And I'm curious about how you build that kind of vision and push it in that direction in order to have it express in a way like that, rather than just kind of pushing out there as sweet fruit dessert kind of deal.
That's a good question. I just remembered a story. It's probably 5 years ago. We just opened our tasting room here in Prescott, and I had this dry blackberry mead. And there's a guy working for us at the time that was really into wine. And I brought this dry blackberry mead out to him, and I told him it was a Pinot Noir. And he tried it and was like, wow, that's really good. I'm like, what do you think? A friend of mine just gave me this, And he totally thought it was wine. I was like, dude, that's a mead. So I realized that when you find dark fruit that has a tannic backbone to balance the sweetness that usually is persistent in certainly a lot of what we do and a lot of meads, you can create a flavor profile and a mouthfeel and an overall experience that's very similar to like a late harvest red wine, certainly ports, things like
Sure.
that. So yeah, I think that like if you for in our case, like when you have blueberry white, it's so smooth, and when you have blackberry white, it's definitely got like a nice tannic punch in there. And so when you stack these different types of fruit juices, so blueberries, raspberries, and blackberries, you're getting tartness, you're getting sweetness, you're getting mouthfeel. The honey's contributing to that. The vanilla is sort of smoothing it all out. And when you had Vanilla Marion, that bottle, we made that in 2017. So that's been sitting around for a while. I mean, you're talking about a 3-year-old mead right now, because that was the first 1,000-gallon batch of anything we put into 375s, and because we've done so many other things, it took a while to sell through that.
Yeah.
And I cracked one of those recently, and I'm like, hey, this is a 3-year-old bottle of mead, and as long as that's stored properly, I mean, it's just out of this world. And I think that all of those things really integrate over time in the bottle. There are a lot of wines I know like Rioja from Spain is classified in part based on the years at rest in the bottle after it's already made before they release it to get to those Reserva, Grand
Right.
Reserva, denominations. So that's a whole nother thing that I wish we had the ability to do as a company was to spend the time it takes to make something great and then forget about it for years in a bottle. And I mean, we have a reserve program where you can experience some of that. There are some examples like Vanilla Marion that are out in the market today that are 3 years old. But most of what we do, you just don't have that ability. You brought up Juiciest Caesar. That's something that I would take the complete opposite approach on when it comes to aging. It's got hops, so while it will still taste good down the road, it's going to stand up to aging, like as far as the quality goes, but the hop flavor is definitely going to fade. So anything we do with coffee or hops, and even vanilla to a point, the vanilla will also, it'll integrate so much that it'll fade away, like Tahitian honeymoon. I mean, that's made to drink when it comes out. I mean, it's going to taste good in a year, but Vanilla Marion's a little bit different animal there because you do have all these other things going on. I think it's a really cool thing to age. But when we're doing hops and citrus, I mean, those just pair so well. I mean, think how many, when you're reading about hop characteristics and you're deciding what to use for your next IPA, I mean, so many of those flavor profiles are coming from the citrus world. Obviously there's like, you think about I mean, sometimes there's these really cool tropical flavors like Samba hops, but, for Juiciest Caesar, we wanted to use, Citra, and we've used Amarillo before. We wanted citrusy flavors to pair with that. And think about honey. Honey goes with everything. I mean, honey even goes with mustard. I had honey mustard the other day as like a side for my burger. I mean, you can put honey with everything. So, I mean, it's just great with hops and citrus as well. But if you're getting Juiciest Caesar or War Honey or anything with hops in, I recommend, enjoying that fresh.
For sure. The way we normally finish off the podcast is, kind of a consistent question. That is, what does success look like for you and for Superstition Meadery? How will you know when you've achieved it? What does it look like? And what's the end goal for you with this?
I think that the most honest answer to that question, the first thing I thought about when you asked that, success looks like me not worrying about losing my house and car. So
hey,
it's like, that's the honest answer, man. Like, we are all in. So there are no investors in our company. It's just my wife and I. Like I said earlier on, we maxed out a credit card to get started. Our first expansion was 5 credit cards and a home equity loan, maxed out. That's been covered now, but now we have 3 SBA loans. Like, we are like driving this train as fast as we can without running off the rails. And it makes sense because we've got momentum. We've got the most amazing fans in the industry. We're making just delicious stuff, new formats all the time. Our tasting room, since we reopened, it's like our numbers are as good as any time of the year. We're about to open the world's first mead and food pairing restaurant in Phoenix. We are doing a historic renovation of a building from 1928. It's a $2 million project. I don't know that anyone's done that in the history of our industry. I mean, for mead specifically and for a restaurant like that. That's just amazing. We're about to break ground on a warehouse across the street from our production facility. And I would say that when all of those things come to fruition, and there's a regulatory thing I'm juggling right now too on how to have actually more winery licenses in the state of Arizona, because we're planning to exceed our annual production cap in the near future as well. When all of those solutions come into fruition, which will be at some point in the middle of 2021, we're going to be at a place where I think I won't have to worry about losing my house and cars anymore. And so that would probably be when I would say, okay, we've done it, But last May, like this time last year, we were just named, my wife and I, the 2019 National Small Business Persons of the Year by the SBA. We went to Washington, D.C., and out of 30 million small businesses, we're named the best in the country, which is amazing. And beyond, I mean, it's so cool to win a medal at the Mazer Cup. That's like the highest honor in our field. It's like the GABF for mead. That's awesome. But to be recognized beyond the mead and craft beverage industry as one of the best companies of its kind in the country, or thereby the world, that was amazing. I mean, that really felt like we had achieved some level of success and recognition. And so that was just amazing for our confidence as business folks and for our staff and for the industry. It made a statement for mead as well. And I think that built, in combination with everything we're building, is going to lead to a real feeling of success in the middle of next year. And if we can prove that our, for us, remote, out of town concept of having a retail establishment in Phoenix will work with everything that we believe in with our customer service and everything, the stories that we tell, that we could duplicate that concept in any city around the world with the right partners. So that's something like our mission is to reintroduce the world's oldest fermented beverage to mankind. That's not just our town or Arizona, it's the country, it's the world. We've been focusing on helping to grow the mead industry, second only to our own company. I've helped write legislation that was introduced to Congress. Like we're working with the SBA to try and get mead its own category in the Code of Federal Regulations. Hopefully we'll have an answer on that this fall. So my wife and I have been so involved with trying to grow our industry as a whole and just continuing to introduce mead as this amazing beverage that you've never had to so many people out there. And I think another sort of like indicator for success is a couple years ago, Budweiser started making fun of mead with the Bud Night and those commercials. I mean, the biggest alcohol producer in the world, the 25th most powerful brand of any company in the world, was spending hundreds of millions of dollars, presumably, on advertising, introducing the concept of mead to people in, NCAA and NFL games. That's hysterical. I mean, remember when they were making fun of bitter beer face and then IPAs became like the most popular style of beer? So not that mead's going to become the most popular style of beer, but I think that there are so many cool indicators, and that 5 years from now, every craft beer bar in the country is going to have at least one tap handle with mead on it, just like they have cider now.
Well, your energy and enthusiasm are contagious, Jeff, and the ambition that you have is matched by talent and drive that I can just hear as you're talking about it. The passion is fantastic. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today. Before we go, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Old Orchard supplies juice blends from Beer City, USA. Hopsteiner is your premium supplier for quality hops and hops products. Spike is your source for reliable home and nano systems. Put Goza, brewing a classic German beer for the modern era, on your reading list. And Craft Beer and Brewing's all-access subscriptions are the best way to support this very podcast. If people want to learn more about Superstition Meadery and what you do, where do they find you, Jeff?
I would go to our website. We have a web store where you can access our products from 40 states and DC. I just posted your amazing article on us, which I think is hands down the best story written about superstition and the mead industry at large. And if you go to our social media, we just posted a link to a video that came out a couple days ago that will really show you the ins and outs of our production facility, our tasting room, and you'll learn some more stories about mead.
Cool. Again, thanks for joining me on the podcast, Jeff. Cheers.
Cool. Cheers, man. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com, or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.